Shaq had just pulled into his driveway when a furious woman marched toward him, eyes blazing with entitlement. "You need to leave. Now!" She snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet street. Neighbors peeked through their windows. A few even stepped outside, sensing drama. But instead of arguing, Shaq leaned back against his car, a smirk creeping onto his face, because he already knew how this was going to end. What happened next flipped the entire neighborhood upside down, shattered the woman's arrogance, and delivered a dose of karma she never saw coming. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The hum of Shaq's black Escalade quieted as he pulled into his driveway, the massive gates closing behind him. He had barely shifted the gear into park when a storm of fury marched toward his car. A middle-aged white woman, blonde hair stiff with hairspray and designer sunglasses perched on her head, stomped forward with an air of entitlement so strong it could be bottled and sold. Shaq hadn't even stepped out when she slammed her hand against his car window. "Excuse me, who gave you permission to be here?" she demanded, her voice shrill and accusatory. Shaq, still wearing his sunglasses, tilted his head slightly, one hand resting on the steering wheel. He could already tell where this was going. My name's on the deed." His deep voice was calm, almost amused. The woman let out a mocking laugh, arms folding tighter over her chest. "Nice try. This is a private neighborhood. You need to leave before I call security." Shaq exhaled through his nose, finally pulling off his sunglasses and turning to face her. She didn't recognize him. That was fine. He'd play along, for now. "Lady, I have security, and you're trespassing." Her face twitched at his response, her lips pursing like she had just sucked on a lemon. "I don't care who you are. You don't belong here." Shaq raised an eyebrow, letting the silence hang between them for a moment. She had said that with her whole chest. No hesitation, no shame. And that's when he knew. This wasn't about his car. It wasn't about some new resident she hadn't met yet. It was about the color of his skin. Monica took a step closer, gripping her designer handbag like she was ready to swing it at him if he didn't comply. But Shaq, he simply leaned back in his seat, a slow smirk forming. "That's so..." Her nostrils flared. "You know what? Let's see what security has to say about that." She yanked out her phone, dialing a number with a self-satisfied grin, unaware that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Monica's perfectly manicured fingers stabbed at her phone screen as she lifted it to her ear, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. "Yes, I'd like to report an intruder at 24 Oakwood Estates," she said, her voice laced with false urgency. Shaq let out a low chuckle, folding his massive arms across his chest. The sheer confidence of this woman was almost impressive. Almost. "Wow, you really just did that?" His deep voice was steady, but the amusement in his eyes made it clear. He wasn't worried. Monica tossed her hair back, adjusting her designer handbag on her arm. "I have every right to. People like you think they can just walk in here?" That last part hit different. Shaq's expression didn't change, but the air between them did. She wasn't even trying to hide it now. Before Shaq could respond, the sound of tires crunching against the pavement filled the air. A black and white security SUV turned the corner and rolled up beside them, its headlights flashing as it came to a stop. A moment later, the driver's door swung open, and out stepped Officer Reed, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, dressed in a crisp private security uniform. His sunglasses reflected the afternoon sun as he adjusted his belt and strode forward. Monica's entire body language changed. She straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, and put on her best concerned resident face. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she called out, gesturing wildly at Shaq. "This man is refusing to leave private property. He doesn't belong here." Reed turned toward Shaq and froze mid-step. His gaze traveled upward, taking in the towering 7-foot legend standing in front of him. For a moment, it was as if the air had been sucked out of the street. Then his jaw dropped. "Wait a second. Shaq?" Monica's confident smirk vanished instantly. Her fingers twitched against her phone as reality began to sink in. She had just called security on one of the most famous men in the world. For a brief moment, Officer Reed simply stood frozen in place, his brow furrowed, as if his mind was struggling to process the scene unfolding before him. His eyes flicked back and forth between the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal and the woman beside him, who stood stiffly with the arms crossed. The confusion on Reed's face didn't last long. Within seconds, recognition dawned in his eyes and his entire demeanor shifted. A broad smile spread across his face as he took a step forward, extending his hand in excitement. "Sir, I'm a huge fan." His voice carried an undeniable enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the tense energy Monica had been radiating just moments earlier. Shaq smirked, taking the man's hand in a firm shake. "Appreciate that, big man." His voice was relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world, completely unaffected by the woman still fuming beside him. But while Reed was caught in a moment of admiration, Monica's confidence cracked like a shattered mirror. The arrogant smirk that had once curled on her lips disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. She took a step forward, practically inserting herself between the two men, her voice rising in frustration. "What? No, no, no! He's trespassing!" She waved a hand in Shaq's direction, her tone filled with growing panic. "I don't care who you think he is. He doesn't belong here, and you need to do something about it." Reed's expression shifted instantly. The friendly grin he had worn seconds ago faded, replaced by an expression of confusion and mild irritation. He slowly turned toward Monica, arms crossing over his chest, a frown settling on his face. "Ma'am, this is his house." Silence fell over the driveway. The weight of those words hung in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. Monica let out a hollow, forced laugh, her shoulders tensing as she shook her head. "That's not possible," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I know everyone who lives here. I've never seen him before." Shaq let out a deep, amused chuckle, as if he had been waiting for this very moment. Without saying a word, he reached into the pocket of his sweats and pulled out a sleek black key fob with a small silver logo. His fingers wrapped around the device as he pressed a button. A loud beep echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Almost immediately, the front doors of the massive mansion behind him unlocked with a soft chime. For a second, no one moved. Monica's face drained of all color as the realization struck her like a brick wall. Her jaw slackened slightly, and her fingers twitched at her sides as if trying to grasp onto some kind of logical explanation. But there was none. Reed, meanwhile, exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. His voice carried the weight of disappointment as he spoke. "Ma'am, you just called security on the homeowner." Monica's posture stiffened as a wave of unease washed over her. She had started this confrontation with unshakable confidence. But now, as her reality unraveled before her, she took a small, unsteady step backward. For the first time, she looked afraid. For the first time since the confrontation began, Monica looked shaken. The bold arrogance she had worn like armor was now cracking under the weight of reality. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come out right away, as if she were scrambling to stitch together an excuse before it was too late. I just thought, I've never seen you here before," she stammered, her voice suddenly unsure. Shaq tilted his head slightly, folding his massive arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. "You thought what?" His voice was calm, yet there was a clear weight behind it, an unspoken challenge in the way he looked at her. "That a black man can't own a mansion here?" Monica's face flushed red. "No, that's not what I meant at all," she blurted out, waving her hands dismissively. Her forced laughter sounded thin and nervous, completely devoid of the confidence she had exuded earlier. "I was just being cautious. You know, looking out for the neighborhood. You can't be too careful these days." Officer Reed scoffed loudly. He had been watching the entire exchange, and now, with his arms crossed and a sharp frown on his face, he wasn't buying a single word of it. "Ma'am, this is profiling," Reed said, his voice firm. "You didn't think twice before accusing this man, before calling security on the actual homeowner. And now that you've been proven wrong, you want to pretend it was all some big misunderstanding?" Monica's mouth opened and closed, her hands clenching at her sides as if searching for some way to argue. But nothing she said could erase what had already happened. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head in amusement, before shifting his stance slightly. "You know what? Let's ask a better question." He raised an eyebrow at her. "Who are you?" For the first time, Monica hesitated. The shift in conversation had caught her off guard. I live across the street," she admitted, her voice quieter than before. Shaq smirked, nodding slowly. "Not for long." Monica's breath hitched as a fresh wave of panic surged through her. She had started this thinking she was in control, but now it was becoming painfully clear. Shaq had the power here. Monica's face had been shifting through shades of confusion, irritation, and barely concealed fear, but nothing could have prepared her for what Shaq did next. Without breaking eye contact, he casually reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a flick of his thumb, he unlocked it and started scrolling through his contacts as if he had already moved on from the conversation. I think I know someone who might be interested in your house, he mused, more to himself than to her. Monica's eyebrows knitted together, and for a split second, her panic vanished, replaced by sheer bewilderment. Excuse me, she snapped. Shaq didn't even look up as he tapped on a contact and brought the phone to his ear. Yo, Mark, he said smoothly, his deep voice carrying through the quiet tension of the front yard. Didn't you say you wanted a house in this neighborhood? Monica's eyes widened in horror, her breath catching in her throat. The realization hit her all at once. You can't do that, she blurted out, her voice cracking slightly. Shaq turned to her now, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. Can't I? He held up a finger, signaling her to wait, before turning back to the call. Yeah, man, the one right across from me. It's got a nice view. Thought you might like it. Monica's hands clenched into fists. You don't even own my house. You can't just sell it. Shaq smirked. Not yet. Officer Reed let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he crossed his arms. He had seen a lot of things in his line of work, but this was next level. Monica's face twisted in disbelief as she stepped forward, her voice desperate. You're bluffing. You have no idea what you're talking about. Shaq simply grinned, his towering frame exuding confidence. Watch me. Monica's pulse pounded as she watched Shaq continue his conversation, her stomach churning with dread. She had started this battle, but she was just now realizing she might have already lost it. Monica Carter stood frozen in place, her mind still reeling from the last few minutes. One moment she had been confidently calling security, certain that she was doing her community a favor by removing what she assumed was an intruder. The next, she had found herself humiliated, standing in front of a man who not only belonged there, but had far more power than she could have ever imagined. As if the situation couldn't get any worse, her phone suddenly buzzed in her pocket. The sharp vibration made her flinch. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling as she pulled it out and glanced at the caller ID. Oakwood Realty. A sense of unease crept up her spine, but she quickly dismissed it. This had to be unrelated. Pressing the phone to her ear, she answered, attempting to regain some control over her shaking voice. Hello? A professional-sounding woman responded almost immediately. Good afternoon, Miss Carter. This is Janet from Oakwood Realty. I'm calling regarding an offer that has just been made on your home. Monica's eyebrows furrowed as she pulled the phone away slightly, staring at the screen as if that would somehow make sense of what she had just heard. Her voice was sharp when she responded, her irritation barely concealed beneath a layer of forced politeness. I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. My house isn't for sale. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by the soft clicking of a keyboard. Janet's voice returned, still polite but slightly hesitant. Oh, well, I assumed it was, considering the offer is significantly over market price. It was submitted just a few minutes ago. A chill washed over Monica as the words settled in. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a creeping sense of dread building in her chest. She felt dizzy, her fingers tightening around the phone as if gripping it hard enough would somehow anchor her back to reality. Her voice, now much weaker, wavered slightly as she managed to force out the only question that mattered. Who made the offer? Another pause. Then, in an almost cautious tone, the realtor responded. A Mr. O'Neill. Monica's breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to tilt. She barely noticed as her knees nearly buckled beneath her, forcing her to reach out and steady herself against the car beside her. It felt like all the air had been sucked from her lungs, leaving behind a suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest. Slowly, as if in a trance, she turned her head to look at Shaq. He was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her with a knowing smirk. The confidence in his posture, the sheer ease with which he held himself, made it abundantly clear that this wasn't a bluff. Her lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time since she had stormed up to him, convinced she was in control, she had no idea what to say. Shaq tilted his head slightly, feigning concern. Something wrong? His voice was steady, calm, the voice of a man who had just flipped the entire situation on its head. Monica's breathing turned ragged, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, wanted to protest, wanted to find some way, any way, to regain control. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't a fight she could win. Her nightmare was only just beginning. Monica's entire body stiffened as she clutched her phone tighter, the blood draining from her face. Her worst nightmare was unfolding in real time, and she had no way to stop it. The realtor's voice on the other end was professional but firm. "Miss Carter, are you still there?" Monica's throat went dry. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to work. You, you said the offer was from who?" A slight pause, then, the name that sent a chill down her spine. "Mr. O'Neill." The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking onto Shaq, who was standing just a few feet away, watching her with that same calm, knowing expression. He had planned this. Her lips trembled as she struggled to process what was happening. You can't just buy my house." Her voice cracked with desperation, her usual arrogance replaced with something much uglier. Fear. Shaq took a slow step toward her, towering over her as he tucked his phone into his pocket. His smirk deepened, his eyes filled with amusement. "Looks like I just did." Monica's breath hitched. She turned in circles, looking for anyone, anything that could get her out of this mess. She spotted Officer Reed, still standing nearby, but the security guard only shrugged. There was nothing illegal about buying a house. "You have no right," Monica shrieked, her hands balling into fists. "This is my home. I've lived here for years." Shaq remained unfazed. "And now you're living on borrowed time." His voice was smooth, almost casual, but the power behind it was unmistakable. "Unless, of course, you'd like to rent it from me." Monica's jaw dropped. Her humiliation was complete. The same man she had tried to throw out of the neighborhood now owned her house. Her breathing turned erratic. This couldn't be happening. Her mind raced for a way out, but there was none. The realization hit her all at once, and with a furious scream, she stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. But it was too late. The deal was done. Monica stood frozen on her porch, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together by sheer force. The rumble of moving trucks echoed through the neighborhood, a cruel reminder that this was really happening. She had fought it. Oh, she had tried, calling her lawyer, pleading with the realtor, even attempting to negotiate with Shaq himself. But none of it worked. The papers were signed, the deal was done, and now she had no choice but to leave. The neighbors gathered on their pristine lawns, whispering behind manicured hands, their eyes darting between Monica's packed belongings and Shaq's towering mansion across the street. Some of them looked amused, others relieved. A deep resentment burned inside her. She had ruled this neighborhood for years, making sure everything stayed exactly how she wanted it. And now, in the span of a few days, she had lost it all. To him. Monica's hands trembled as she watched the movers haul out her expensive furniture. Her once grand living room set was now being loaded onto a truck, like it was nothing more than disposable junk. It wasn't just her house she was losing. It was her reputation, her control, her place in this world. A sharp gust of wind blew past, sending a chill down her spine. She turned slowly, glaring across the street at Shaq's mansion. It stood there like a monument to her downfall, mocking her. He had won. Completely. With a final huff, Monica stomped toward her car, yanking open the driver's side door. She hesitated for just a second, scanning the neighborhood one last time. Would they even miss her? She already knew the answer. Without another word, Monica slammed the door shut and revved the engine. Tires screeched against the pavement as she sped off, leaving behind the life she had once controlled, and the man who had taken it all away. Monica thought the nightmare was over. She thought she could at least walk away with some dignity, even if it meant leaving behind the home she had ruled for years. But she had no idea Shaq had one final surprise left for her. A few days after she sped away, the quiet, exclusive neighborhood of Oakwood Estates was disrupted once again. Not by moving trucks, but by news vans. Bright camera lights flashed, microphones were raised, and reporters crowded in front of what used to be Monica's house. She had been avoiding the news, refusing to see any coverage of her downfall. But curiosity got the best of her. When she finally turned on the TV, her stomach twisted into knots. On screen, a news anchor beamed with excitement. In an incredible act of generosity, NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal has officially donated this luxury home to the Oakwood Women's Shelter. The property, previously owned by Monica Carter, will now serve as a safe haven for women and children in need. Monica's jaw dropped. The camera panned to Shaq, standing in front of her former house, smiling as he handed over the keys to the shelter's director. The same front yard where she had tried to throw him out was now a place of hope for those less fortunate. Reporters swarmed him. "Shaq, what made you decide to donate this home?" He grinned. "Well, I just thought this place could use some better energy. A home should be a place of warmth, not judgment." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The director of the shelter wiped away tears of gratitude. "Mr. O'Neill, you just changed so many lives today." But Monica? She wasn't laughing. She was seething. Her grip tightened around her phone as she watched the coverage. This wasn't just a loss, this was humiliation on a national level. A rage-filled scream echoed through her empty apartment as she hurled the remote at the TV screen. Shaq hadn't just taken her house. He had destroyed her legacy. Monica had spent years carefully crafting her reputation in Oakwood Estates. She was known as a woman of influence, someone who hosted exclusive events, attended charity galas, and always carried herself with an air of authority. She took pride in the fact that people listened when she spoke, that her opinions held weight in the community. But in a matter of hours, everything she had built began to crumble before her eyes. It all started with a single video. The footage of her confrontation with Shaq spread like wildfire, appearing on every major social media platform. It was shared, commented on, and dissected by millions. The world had seen it all: her arrogance, her blatant prejudice, the way she had smugly assumed that Shaq did not belong. Every word she had spoken, every sneer she had made, was now playing on loop for an audience far larger than she had ever imagined. The internet had given her a name: Oakwood Karen. The hashtag #Karma for Karen trended for hours, then days. People mocked her entitlement, her ignorance, and the sheer audacity she had shown by calling security on a man in his own home. Memes flooded social media. Screenshots of her shocked expression when the security guard recognized Shaq were turned into GIFs. Some even dug into her past, uncovering old HOA complaints and instances where she had made similar accusations against other residents. But the most devastating blows did not come from strangers online. At first, Monica tried to ignore the digital firestorm, convincing herself that it would pass. But then her real-life connections began distancing themselves. The women she had once considered friends stopped responding to her messages. Business associates who had previously sought her out for partnerships were suddenly unavailable. The boutique she managed saw a significant drop in clientele. People no longer whispered about Monica Carter with admiration or respect. They whispered in hushed tones about the woman who had embarrassed herself on a global scale. Still, she believed she could fix it. In desperation, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she never thought she would: Shaq. Her fingers trembled as the phone rang once, then twice. She closed her eyes, inhaling sharply, willing herself to remain composed. If she could just explain, if she could just make him see that this was all a misunderstanding. The line clicked. A deep voice came through. "This is Shaq. Leave a message." Beep. Monica hesitated. Her throat felt dry. This was her only chance to make things right. "Shaquille, please. Can we talk?" she whispered. But the days passed. Her phone never rang. For the first time in years, Oakwood Estates felt different. The tension that had once loomed over the neighborhood had lifted, replaced by a sense of relief, warmth, and community. Without Monica Carter's ever-watchful glare, the residents felt more at ease. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now stopped to chat. Kids played freely without the fear of being reprimanded for disturbing the peace. The atmosphere had shifted, and it all led back to one person: Shaquille O'Neal. In a powerful act of generosity, Shaq transformed Monica's former house into something far greater than just another luxury mansion. He turned it into a space for change, a symbol of second chances. The grand estate, once guarded by exclusivity and privilege, had now become a center for community outreach and charity events. The very house where prejudice had tried to take root was now a beacon of unity. And tonight, it was filled with life. The mansion's grand patio overflowed with guests, local families, influential figures, and members of the community who had been personally impacted by Shaq's generosity. The warm glow of string lights stretched across the yard, casting a golden hue over the lively crowd. Laughter rang through the air as people mingled, enjoying the live jazz band and catered cuisine. At the center of it all, Shaq stood tall, smiling as he looked around at the celebration. Jordan, the young security officer who had first recognized him, approached with a plate of food in hand. "Man, this is crazy. I still can't believe you did all this," he said, shaking his head in amazement. Shaq chuckled. "What's crazier? That I turned this house into something positive, or that people actually thought I didn't belong here?" Jordan grinned. "Definitely the second one." The two clinked their glasses together in a silent toast before Shaq stepped forward, raising his voice so the crowd could hear. "Y'all know, when I first moved into this neighborhood, I wasn't exactly given a warm welcome." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. "But look around. This is what happens when we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. It's not about the house you own. It's about the impact you make." He lifted his glass high, scanning the room filled with smiling faces. A slow, satisfied smirk crossed Shaq's lips as he raised his glass one last time. "To better neighbors." The universe has a funny way of balancing the scales. Months had passed since Monica Carter had been forced out of the neighborhood she once ruled with judgment and arrogance. The viral humiliation, the social exile, and the brutal sting of karma had done their work. Once an entitled elitist woman who prided herself on exclusivity, Monica now found herself on the other side of life. And fate wasn't done with her yet. Inside a modest retail store tucked away in a strip mall on the outskirts of town, Monica Carter stood behind the cash register, wearing a stiff red uniform and a plastic name tag. She had been avoiding eye contact with customers all day, dreading the possibility that someone from her past might recognize her. Then her worst nightmare walked through the door. Shaquille O'Neal. The second she saw him, her breath caught in her throat. Her face went pale, hands tightening around the counter as if bracing for impact. She looked away quickly, hoping, praying, that he wouldn't notice her. But Shaq had already seen her. He stepped forward, towering over the register, his deep brown eyes glinting with something between amusement and poetic justice. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, letting the tension build. Monica swallowed hard, forcing a weak smile. "Welcome to Market Mart. Did you find everything okay?" Her voice trembled, betraying the desperation in her tone. Shaq smirked. "Funny seeing you here." The weight of those four words crushed her. She couldn't even respond. Her mind scrambled for a way out, but there was none. Shaq casually placed his items on the counter. Nothing extravagant, just a bottle of water and a pack of gum. He didn't need anything fancy to make his point. Monica fumbled with the scanner, her fingers shaking as she rang up the purchase. The total popped up on the screen, $2.89. Shaq reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He placed it on the counter, sliding it toward her with deliberate slowness. "Keep the change." Monica's eyes flickered between the bill and his face. The humiliation burned her from the inside out, but she couldn't refuse. She mumbled a barely audible, "Thank you." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Then without another word, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving Monica standing there, drowning in the consequences of her own actions. The door chimed as he left, and Monica finally exhaled. But deep down she knew this was a moment she would never forget.